what does Juneteenth mean to us here in Jersey City, New Jersey? We're 2,500 miles away from Galveston, Texas. What does it mean for us? And so then I said to myself, well, what are the parallels? What are the things that happened here that happened there? And so we start nearly 500 years ago. We start in 1524 and 1526, where two black men of color and Portuguese heritage discover the shores of Hudson Valley and the area of Spain, which then became Mexico, which then became Texas, both by the first name of Esteban. So we start with that, and then we go to the question of slavery here. And Senator Cunningham opened the door, and this is the dangerous part. She opens the door, and we start to talk about those first Africans that came here. All right, 6 years after coming and landing in Virginia. Those first Africans that were a part of the Dutch West Indies slave trade come here, 11 of them, in 1626. So what happens? You know, Sandy opened the door and said, well, they're not quite slaves and they're not quite indentured servants. And the one thing you should know, and this is how quirky history is, it's just not linear. The court case that established permanent servitude was brought by a Virginia black slave owner. A Virginia black slave owner. And so we have this circumstance of quirky history. How could you imagine that to be? But here, when those first 11 Africans came, you would think that they were slaves for life. But in 20 years of their enslavement, they're free. And more than that, they're landed gentry. You see, we had a governor by the name of Keith who ran this province. And not too far from here, in 1644, he massacred a whole group of Lenni Lenape Indians down by Exchange Place. And the result was predictable. The Indian community annihilated this part of the New Amsterdam settlement. So what did the folk think about doing? They said, well, if we create a buffer zone and give this land to these black folk, and they'll have to deal with the Indians, they become landed gentry. It goes all around what was then what we think of now as New York City. So that's the open door that they kind of opened for me that I wanted to jump into. What does it mean for us to be a part of this celebration that has gone national? And I was heartened to hear about Senator Cunningham's legislation in regards to the state, because we know that when General Granger gave his proclamation through the colored troops to the folk in Galveston, there were still black folks enslaved here. They were enslaved here. They were enslaved here almost a year after the proclamation in Galveston. What freed them? It wasn't the Emancipation Proclamation. All right? It wasn't the Emancipation. Why is that? Because the Emancipation Proclamation only gave liberty to those black folk that were enslaved in the counties of the states, of the rebelling states. That's all it did. Did New Jersey fight for the North? Yes. Did we have a quirky history in regards to that? Yes. Here in this area, what we had were factories that were supplying the South with goods and other items. So folk here didn't really want the war. They didn't really want to support Lincoln. They didn't really want to lose that money. They didn't want to lose that money. So, what do we do here? We know that in 1804, they passed what was called the Gradual Emancipation Act. Sounds good. Sounds very good. But when they passed that act, it came into effect on July 4th. They wanted you all to have something to celebrate. They wanted you to celebrate in a few weeks, we're going to have the 4th of July. Well, Frederick Douglass said, what does the 4th of July mean to us? What does it mean to us? All right, so they passed, here in New Jersey, they passed the Gradual Emancipation Act. If you were born on July 3rd, 1804, you were a slave for life. If you were born on July 4th, you were a slave, male 25, female 21. But there was a twist to that. Because when you, as that term of slave, it was called, when you gave birth, your children were slaves and had to serve another term. So, this got a little bit contradictory and hypocritical. So the state in 1846, they passed a change of terminology bill. That's what I want to call it. A change in terminology bill. You were no longer a slave, you just happened to be a permanent indentured servant. A permanent indentured servant. So, when the Emancipation Proclamation is passed on January 1, 1863, it didn't involve us. But Juneteenth is about more than that. Within 60 days of the Emancipation Proclamation, Frederick Douglass came here, spoke here, came to the streets of Jersey City on February 22nd, 1863. Proclamation to black men here. You are now going to fight for your own liberty. You're now going to fight for your own liberty. And he went around the country, but it's important to recognize that he came here within 60 days of that Emancipation Proclamation. So, when Appomattox fell, Lee surrenders to Grant, all right? When you have 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, you have this push in Galveston, Texas, but you also had a push here. And so one of the things that we have at the museum, and Reverend, we have fine art, so we're gonna talk. One of the things that we have at the museum is original artifacts. Wow. All right, so I'm holding manacles. Wow. Not just manacles, I'm holding authentic manacles, which means that someone was enslaved, someone had to wear them, someone had to endure slavery in America. But these are not just simple manacles. They have a message to them. What message could be in steel? Well, there's the horror of slavery, there is servitude, but there's a greater message in them. You see, and I'm going to pass this around because sometimes when we talk about slavery, we just think of black folk. Well, half of Europe was enslaved. The Great Wall of China was built by Chinese slaves. At the same time the transatlantic slave trade was going on, black folk were enslaving in the Barbary pirate slavery of the Mediterranean. So it's important that you recognize that slavery is not based on race, although it is in part. It's based on economics. And that's why, here's another, since the Assemblywoman opened the door, I got to jump through it. That's why you have to take a look at the clauses in the Constitution that are still there for involuntary servitude. You know, it's in the 13th Amendment. You know, I don't know if any of you go to the theater. I love August Wilson, that black playwright that chronicled our history. There's a play called Job Turner's Come and Gone. And it is about the South, where you could be walking the street and not have 25 cents in your pocket, and then be arrested for vagrancy and loitering, and then suddenly you're on a farm or in an iron foundry working for someone because you couldn't pay the fine. Involuntary servitude. So we have to be aware of this. We have to know the details of our history. So let me just close that door and go back to my slave shackles. On these shackles, there is a message. So when I talk to young people, I say, what message would you give to a relative, a brother, sister, aunt, and uncle, mother or father, who were going to have to go through enslavement? What would you say? Think about it. What would you say if you had to go through it? Well, this message is in the visual language of the Ndinkras from West Africa. And on the side, there are triangles that go up and down. There are diamonds in the middle. And in the language of our symbology, and I see all these beautiful kente cloth and colors, and you know, I just want you to know everything you got on there, sister, has a message to it. Where you have the diagonals, that's life always changes. Where you have a symbol of something upside down, that means that faith can proceed. On these shackles, there's a message. The message is perform the impossible. Perform the impossible. So what does that mean here? Well, that means that the NAACP was formed in 1918, and the author of the song, Lift Every Voice, James Weldon Johnson, brings that message to Jersey City. Perform the impossible. That means that the Pullman Porters and their hub over there perform the impossible. Defeat the largest American corporation, embarrass America, force Roosevelt to impose laws that give them the right. Perform the impossible. That means that Dr. Cannon, George Cannon, runs for the state assembly. That means here. That means that Prince Albert Sample runs for the state assembly. Both lose. 2 years later, Dr. Walter Alexander from Orange, New Jersey, wins. That means that we get a mayor, all right, you know who I'm talking about, Mayor Cunningham. We get a mayor because Addison McLeon says to a young police officer, you can be more. Perform the impossible. Addison McLeon becomes the first elected state assemblyman. Perform the impossible. That means that we get the city council president who has her roots with Fred Martin, who becomes city council president. All right? And for a short period of time, for a day, becomes the mayor of Jersey City. Because the mayor happened to be other places. Perform the impossible. All right? What it means is that the politicians that we see, the people that serve us and work for us, are following the message of the shackles. So Juneteenth is not just a Galveston festival. Juneteenth must be a festival, must be important, so that we take a look back, we think about, we pray about, and we work about performing the impossible. Thank you very much.